So, welcome everybody. My name is James Farlow, and this is Sanctuary's webinar, We Need to Talk. We're here with Stacy Chomiak, Danny Cortez, Ken Wilson, and Emily Swan to talk about how to have conversations about gender and sexuality in your local church. Before we get started, just a little bit of background on Sanctuary. My wife, Rebecca, and I co-founded Sanctuary to create safe worship space. We've spent almost a decade now in the LGBT Christian community, and in the process of being involved in that community, we have felt really, really cared for. It's been a place where we've been able to see the presence of God, and it's also been a place of life and growth for us. But at the same time, we've seen that so many of our friends haven't had a safe place to go to church, to talk. And of course, for churches themselves, it's often not safe. Pastors and leaders have a hard time figuring out how to have this conversation. So we really believe there's a deep need for a safe place where people can ask questions, talk to each other, and worship together. So that's just a little picture of what we are and what we're trying to do. We do this through having conversations, worshiping together, and listening to stories. Today we're having a conversation with these fine folks right here. And in just a second, they're going to tell you a little bit more about yourselves. One announcement that I have is that next week we're going to be doing some community groups that are online that you can log into. You can see other people from a distance, but it's going to be for pastors, and it's going to be led by Danny and Ken. And they're doing that so that you can have a safe private space to kind of talk about your concerns and questions, whether you come from a traditional or progressive perspective, and figuring out how do we become a more welcoming community. Or what does it look like? How do I get to know the LGBT community? Questions like that. That's going to start next week on Tuesday at the same time. And if you want to know more, you can. If you already know Ken or Danny, you can contact them. Or you can go to our website, www.sanctuaryforall.org. It's there on the side. And you can send us a message and say, I'm a pastor, this is my name, this is my church. That information is confidential. And when you send us a message, we'll get back to you and let you know how you can sign up. So that's that quick announcement. But now we're going to go ahead and get started. And these folks are going to tell you a little bit about themselves. And we're going to start with Danny.
Hi, my name is Danny Cortez. I'm the pastor or co-pastor of New Heart Community Church over in Southern California. And our church was planted back in 1997 as a Southern Baptist church plant. I was ordained in the Southern Baptist Convention. And for me, this conversation began because there were a lot of LGBTQ students coming from Biola University attending my church, and every year there was always someone coming out to me, 1 to 3 students, who would confide in me that they were quote-unquote struggling with their sexuality. And so as a church, as a traditional Southern Baptist church, we gave the common script of, God can change you, we'll help you through reparative therapy, we'll get you some counseling. But I think it was almost 8 years ago now where I got into a deeper conversation with one of the lesbian people from Biola, who began to share with me more deeply and just developed a real close friendship. And I remember thinking that there's something unsettling about this, and there were a lot of other things that happened. But so almost 8 years ago, I began more of an intentional study with someone else from my church to try to figure out, why aren't we loving LGBTQ people well? And so I think for me, when I started this journey, it wasn't to change my mind necessarily, but how we as a church congregation could be more loving and accepting of people where they weren't, where we weren't driving them away from church or causing them psychological damage. But what happened was almost 2 years ago now, or about 2 years ago, ended up that I had a theological shift on this. And so I, on a personal level, believe that God can blame same-sex unions. And so when I brought that up to the elders of the church, There were 3 other elders, including myself, so four men. And when I brought it up to the church, it was clear that the 3 other elders, were pretty upset about it. They felt like it was a betrayal. And so that, for us, began this about a 5-month process as a church of trying to discern what God would have us be as a church. And so, yeah, it ended up, and so as I'm part of this discussion, I want you to know that I don't feel like I'm expert at all. In fact, our church ended up going through a split, and so it was a difficult process, but I think it was a process that I think all of us who were part of it on all sides were able to glean and see some of the mistakes we made along the way, and also some of the good. But hopefully, my voice and other voices can help other churches, navigate through this discussion. And so, look forward to the questions that might be presented today.
Thanks, Danny. I think we're going to go to Emily now, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her story.
Hi there, I'm Emily Swan. I'm the co-pastor of Blue Ocean Faith Ann Arbor. I'm co-pastor with Ken Wilson, who's also on this call. And gosh, I grew up in a much more conservative church. I grew up in one of the more conservative elements of the Vineyard movement as a kid, and just didn't really entertain the idea that I was gay. I'm a partnered lesbian woman, married to my wife Rachel now for a couple of months. And I think I went through probably most of my 20s just sort of in denial about my own sexuality because I knew what that would cost me. I was, at the time in my late 20s, I was kind of a pastor in training and then later a missionary and a pastor on staff at a Vineyard church. But about the time I I was in my early 30s, probably 31, I just really had to stop and sort of take account of my life and of what was actually going on with me, and just came to this realization that, like, no, I'm gay, and I have to figure out how this intersects with my vocation, with my calling, with my family, with all of those things. At the time I was on the mission field, I knew that wasn't going to be a popular thing to say to my supporters, and I was trying to figure out, like most people who grow up in a more conservative part of the church, I had to spend some time considering the biblical texts and seeing what I thought about those things. At the time I was studying through Fuller Seminary, doing sort of their international distance learning for missionaries, and so I spent my ethics class that I took with Glenn Stassen sort of writing a paper, figuring that out, and realized that I didn't actually have any theological objections and probably really hadn't had any objections in terms of my sort of gut instinct for how I pastored people before I had them for myself, because I didn't know what that would mean. So I was still, as my wife says, hoping for bi, because that would make my life a lot easier. So I came back to the States, and I was pastoring on staff with Ken and another pastor, 2 other pastors, and dating men and hoping that would work, and it was not working for me. And I finally kind of came to a low point where I realized, okay, Lord, I decided not to date for a while for the sake of our church, because Ken was working on his book, A Letter to My Congregation. We thought we were moving our church toward a place of inclusion and acceptance, to where a church I had been part of for 15 years and kind of came into maturation as a leader in would be able to accept me. And I wasn't sure, though, where we were at, so I reached this low point, and I just started talking to God about that and told him, I don't know what this is going to mean for my job or for the church or for whatever, but I'm lonely and I need a partner in this life. At the time, I think I was 35, 36. Anyway, I was in my mid to upper 30s. And I started a 40 days of faith, like a personal sort of fast and time of praying, just opening my heart to God and saying, I don't know what this means, but I need someone, or I need you to do something. And at the end of that, I met my wife, Rachel. She literally walked into our church for a conference, and we started talking, and I realized and recognized that God had sent this gift, I felt like, along to me. And I knew that for my own sake, I needed to pursue that relationship. And so I talked with Ken, and he was excited for me, and we were trying to figure out, how to talk to our congregation in circles, thinking that we would probably be okay in terms of our church, that we might lose a few, but that we had successfully transitioned enough. But we didn't calculate. We had another pastor on staff who at that point did kind of a switch on us. And it happened in the midst of sort of this perfect storm where our national denomination was already coming down on Ken for the book that he wrote, and then when I was outed and they discovered that I was dating, they used that as sort of the silver bullet to send us a letter saying that our church needed to agree to never perform a gay marriage, never have a gay pastor on staff, and fire me. And so we spent all of last fall kind of working that out in our congregation. I had to come out publicly from the pulpit, and the eventual result of that was that Ken and I, I was asked to resign. Ken ultimately resigned for refusing to fire me, and we started Blue Ocean Faith Ann Arbor and took about 200 people with us to do that. And so, like Danny, I would say that there's some certain things that maybe we miscalculated or that could have been done better, and we also ended in a split, but that I think we learned quite a few things along the way, and that there were quite a few things that we did very well, so I hope those will be useful.
Great. Thanks. And so, Ken, let's hear from you.
Yeah, I'm Ken Wilson. I co-pastor with Emily, Blue Ocean Faith Ann Arbor. I'm 63. I came to faith in the Jesus movement in 1971 after being an atheist for a period of time, it was the part of the Jesus movement that before the religious right had kicked in. So I didn't have any strong opinions on homosexuality or all the big hot button issues that are so prominent today. As part of my early Jesus connection, was involved in the charismatic renewal in the 1970s, and our church came out of that movement. Started in my living room in 1975, and my story is pretty similar to Danny's in terms of taking a long time after more pastoral experience and noticing how many people that I knew who were young and conflicted about their sexuality and were gay and decided to get married, and those marriages falling apart and them not really being able to sustain their healing that they got through ex-gay ministries and that sort of thing, and just a lot of evidence accumulated, and I began to rethink the issue. I probably started a serious rethink on the question, I don't know, maybe 2003, 2004 or so. And, at that time, and still to this day, there really aren't safe places for pastors to have conversations. I can remember talking to our church joined the Vineyard in 1993, and I became a national leader in Vineyard. I was on the national board for 7 years of Vineyard USA, and I was a regional overseer of about 115 Vineyard churches in the Great Lakes region during that time. And so I had a lot of colleagues, and I knew a lot of people in the broader evangelical world. I was involved in some of the environmental evangelical issues and met a lot of the more significant evangelical leaders. And just for me to disclose to people like that I was even rethinking the question, I felt like I had to use all my relational equity just to have that coming out conversation, if, as you were, just saying I'm not satisfied with the traditional consensus and I'm looking at this question. I remember thinking, gosh, this is like the mother of all controversies in the church right now, and I'm having to rethink it, and I don't have any group learning curve. I don't have colleagues that I can speak candidly with about this. I could talk with my wife, I could talk with the pastors on our staff, but it was the fear surrounding the mere process of beginning to ask questions is quite considerable for anyone in the evangelical orbit. So that was I'm sure Danny can relate to that experience. So I eventually came clear on the issue, clear enough to say that I didn't think that the handful of biblical texts that were prohibiting same-gender sexual activity, I thought they were addressing other issues than the kind of couples that we were seeing in our church. Lesbian couple who adopted difficult to adopt children, and had been faithful to each other for the past 10, 15 years, and one or both of the partners loved Jesus and felt that their relationship with one another was blessed by God. I didn't think that the biblical texts were addressing these questions. They were addressing issues like pederasty and slave sex and temple prostitution and very obvious to anyone abhorrent exploitative practices. But whether they were addressing these other more modern questions, I thought was really unclear. And so there just wasn't enough evidence to continue to do exclusionary practices, which I over time began to see were actually harmful to LGBT people who were part of churches that even did a fairly soft exclusionary approach, like no ordained clergy, no gay weddings. I could see the effect on these dear souls was stigmatizing, and it was harmful to them. And I read the literature about the harm of kids who are raised in churches who are gay, and if they have traditional views on LGBT, there's a negative outcome for them in terms of their mental health outcomes, and it just didn't seem like the fruit of the Holy Spirit to me. So I eventually came to a point where I said, well, this is a disputable matter, and we should err on the side of full inclusion. That's what I eventually ended up writing a letter to my congregation, literally, to unpack these issues, try to bring them into what's the experience of being a pastor wrestling with these very complex moral questions, far beyond the sound bites of the internet and the litmus test of orthodoxy that we generate. But when you're actually face to face with people who are wrestling with these issues, like we are with questions of remarriage after divorce, that sort of thing, I wanted to bring the congregation into what it was like to be a pastor in that context, trying to sort out a thorny issue like LGBT, and ended up writing a letter to my congregation, and then eventually, for a variety of reasons, felt I needed to publish it in order to get word out there as word was spreading about my views. So I did that, and that kind of lit a firestorm within my denomination, and resulted in eventually Emily and I planting out, so to speak. It's a euphemistic way of describing it. It was kind of a control. It was a controlled split, really, but that was done as well as we could possibly do it at the time. But it was a difficult process. I characterized it. It was a difficult labor and delivery and a beautiful baby. So we now have a congregation of a couple hundred people, and including people who are unresolved on the question of the morality of same-gender relationships, but we're fully inclusive, meaning we don't discriminate against LGBT people in any way, have no policies of discrimination, and don't practice that in any way. So yeah, that's my story in a nutshell.
Great. Well, thanks. Well, Stacy, I'm looking forward to hear your story as well. I hear some commonalities with all of us.
Yes, thank you for inviting a Canadian on this conversation. I appreciate it. My name is Stacy Chomiak, and I'm coming at this thing from a little different than you guys, more of a congregant view, so I'm happy to have my voice included. So my background is similar to Emily as well. I grew up in Winnipeg, Canada, and very conservative in a very large church, and always going to youth group and just loving being church, and sort of grew up in the sort of perpetual Christian bubble, if you will, and sort of loving it. And I didn't think anything about the gay issue. I think I remember thinking, like, that must be hard for those people who ever struggle with that. That wouldn't be me. I don't even swear, so that wouldn't be my issue. But I think about 1997, when I was about 17, I started thinking, I don't really think that all these guys I'd never really been allowed to ask questions. Again, growing up in the church, you get the sense that being gay is sort of the worst on the hierarchy of sins, but you don't really ever have the allowance to talk about it. So I just continued on with my life and my journey of eventually marrying a music leader, of course, some good-looking guy, and found myself in a relationship with a woman, a close friend, around 18, and that really, really threw me off, because I didn't track on the note, so to speak, and that didn't really work. A few years passed, and I felt that, okay, this is going to be an issue. I'm going to have to be celibate. This is going to be my journey. And around 2003, I met Tammy, who's now my wife, and we began because, maybe I can do this, no I can't, maybe I can do this, no I can't. I couldn't rectify my faith with this worse sin, and I always wanted to be authentic, and I just didn't feel like, how can I embrace sin and be authentic? About to turn 30, and similar to Emily, I felt like I need to have some alone time with God, and so I took a week on my own and just sort of journaled and prayed, and I just felt, either this is the time when I feel like I'm going to have to be honest with everybody, because I wasn't really out at all, and say that this is who I am, or I'm going to be in a relationship with Tam forever, or I'm going to be celibate and we'll break up. What are you saying? And I honestly felt at the end of that week that a huge peace just settled into me, and I felt him say it's okay to embrace both, and we'll bless you. So we got engaged a couple months later, and sort of went on Facebook. So of course that means you're out, of course, everybody. So we in 2010, which is the year we got engaged, we decided to move our lives to Vancouver, Canada, for my career, and began the church at that point for the search for a church, because we both felt that we understood the evangelical background, but of course they didn't. And that was sort of an interesting juxtaposition of issues, because everyone said, well, just find a United Church or find an Anglican church, and I didn't feel that my sexuality should dictate where I go to church. So I felt that let's find the churches in our area that I can relate to the beliefs, and that I feel is like a Jesus believing church, and we'll see what happens. So I emailed a whole bunch of churches for about the first year that we moved here, and you got the typical response. I was honest. I said, me and my fiance, it's not me and my roommate. We want to be involved, and we want to just serve, and we want to be able to help out just any church. And most of them, of course, said, well, of course you're welcome, but here's these verses, and we wouldn't allow you to do this and this and this. I mean, definitely you can give your money, but if you want to help out, I think that might be an issue. So, we didn't feel too good about those things. So we eventually got a response from this little church in North Vancouver called The Cove. And the pastor, Sean, said, we have no issue. We totally love everybody. Like, come and meet us. So we thought, let's just check it out. So we went there, and this was 2011. We went and met Sean and met the congregation, and it was Hampson stays. So I think within a week we were in a small group. I was starting to help with worship. We even helped with Sunday school. It was literally a non-issue. So we just continued on in the congregation for about a year and a half, and we got more and more involved and just loved well, we want to become members. This church was a church plant of what's called the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church Canada. As you can probably guess, is very conservative. Didn't feel that this was an issue. I mean, they got to know us. I don't know that any of them really knew gay people before, but they got to know us. And so I think for them, their relationship is what changed their views. So when we talked to Sean, the pastor, about becoming members, and he said, you know what, I'm behind you, but you have to know that on paper, the Alliance Church is not for this. So he said, but we're going to go ahead and see what happens. So we thought, well, that's amazing. We thought you were going to say, well, we can't. So, of course, the larger Alliance Church got wind of it, and they sent some people from the head office to come and check out our church, and had some interviewing of the congregation and said, what's happening, what's going on here, and found out that, oh, there's a gay couple. There was at this time a couple more gay couples, but we were the only ones wanting to become members. So they then saw this and sent a formal letter to our pastor and the board and said, you know, we love what you're doing, but we can't be allowing of you to make them members. And actually a really beautiful thing happened, and what happened is that our church said, well, behind us, and said, if our church down, essentially, then maybe this is what God's story is supposed to look like.
Hey,
so
Stacey?
In 2013, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, occasionally you cut out, and actually I think you said our church said something, and I actually missed that, so I'd love to hear that. So they got the letter, and then your church said what?
They got the letter, and the church said basically that we don't care what you think about it, that it doesn't make sense for us to theologically shun these people. So their love for us was larger than the theological outlines on paper. So I think that was with, you know, what's on paper, and they sort of, people get hurt. And so this was an example for us of the church standing up and saying, we actually love you more than we love the theology, and we're not sure how that works, but we're going to see what happens. So essentially, Cove did have to shut down April 2013 because they stood up for us. So, and it was a small church, so the Alliance cut the funding and took to continue, but it was a very beautiful experience, because it was just understanding that sort of love that people have, that go what's supposed to look like, especially for the church. So I'm just really grateful to have been a part of that.
Thanks. I know the first time I heard your story, it was really powerful for me too. I think we caught most of your story. There was a couple times where we had just a little bit of delay. I think the U.S.-Canada border is putting something in to block a little bit of the transmission. But thank you so much for sharing. For all those who are watching right now, and I see there's a number of people online, if you have any questions for these folks, there's an app. You should see something that says Q&A. Or place for questions. Please go ahead and ask questions, and they will appear to me. And I have some pre-submitted questions from other people as well. But if you have any questions that are coming up live as you're hearing these folks chat, please feel free to ask them. You can do it there, or you can tweet to us at our Twitter feed, Sanctuary for All, and we'll take those questions. But I have a couple that I wanted to start with, and a pastor asked me. One of the key questions he had was, what were the issues and struggles this transition raised that you did not expect? So anybody for that one?
Well, I could say, I mean, there were a lot of struggles that I did expect, primarily financial struggles, knowing that people who are more conservative on this question are often very generous supporters of the church. And that people leave over this question because it's become kind of a litmus test of biblical orthodoxy. So those things. The thing that surprised me the most was that we had a lot of people who were, because we had been doing a change process on this over some period of time. I I'd released my letter to anyone who wanted to read it. We were interacting with people, meeting with leaders to discuss it, all that sort of thing. And so we had a lot of input from people who were saying they were very supportive of us and very, like allies to this cause even, who, when push came to shove, when people they cared about in the church left the church over this question, they became like deeply offended. Or if they had family members who would be upset that they went to a church with a gay pastor, or if they went to a church that was fully inclusive of LGBTQ people, that they would lose standing in their family relationships. Those allies on paper quickly evaporated. And what really mattered was not so much what they thought about the issue or their stand on the question or how they read the Bible, but if they had to pay a social cost within their social matrix, most people, many people were unwilling to do that. And that was surprising and somewhat disappointing as well.
Yeah, and the people who were able to do it, we found the people who came with us in our congregation and were supportive, many of them, it felt like, had their own stories of exclusion, and it was like they could relate to that being the outsider, whether it was they'd had a stutter as a kid or they had mental illness or whatever it was, that they had felt stigmatized at some time in their life. And it was like the compassion and the empathy that they had was what was superseding everything else.
Yeah, I hear that common thread. In fact, both in what you're talking about in terms of theology and Danny, and talking to talking to the LGBT people you met before you changed, was how much the theology kind of broke down in that personal relationships, and I hear that almost the same in what you're saying, what you guys are saying now, is that there was a theology even to affirm, but then the social cost was what changed and flexed that.
I think for our church, one of the surprising things was that the people I thought would become a third-way church and understand the importance of inclusion ended up leaving. And the people that I thought would leave ended up staying. And so kind of interesting. And I mean, this is not clear across the board, but there were a lot of surprises that way. Mm-hmm. So I think just because you think somebody will be hardline doesn't always mean they're going to be hardline.
Yeah.
There were quite a few surprises on both ways. But along with that, I mean, there were, within our congregation, families were split in half. The husband and the wife were in different ends of the spectrum. And so for us, it became more important that there had to be a third way, because even within families, what are families going to do? Go to two different churches? And so, for us, we realized that beliefs are a hard thing. You can't just turn them on and off. There's this process. There's this experiential process. There's a theological, thing that you have to think through. There's relationships you have to think through. And I think what surprised us most, though, as a congregation, was how exhausted everyone was. I mean, this was 5 months of continual conversation, and I remember as a church we were just wiped out. And so it made me realize, we only experienced this for 5 months. I can't even imagine people who are actually LGBTQ who've had to have these conversations their whole life. And so, yeah, I think, there were a lot of things that I didn't expect, and those two definitely are highlights of it.
Well, what kind of, another question kind of piggyback on that is, what kind of biblical or theological education did you do with your congregation prior to taking this step, or did you not?
Well, I could respond to that. First of all, just to notice, it's a real dilemma for a pastor how to tackle this question in the church. Especially, we had a number of gay couples who were part of our congregation, and some people from transgender backgrounds, and so we had sexual minorities in the church while this transition was being made, and it's really difficult to know how to have the conversation about it when you have sexual minorities in the room, because imagine that you were divorced and remarried, and the church were going to have a big conversation about when is it appropriate to get divorced and remarried. The people who are divorced, who are in the room, feel stigmatized by being part of this. Like, it's like the most intimate part of their personal being is under a kind of communal microscope. And so I think knowing how to navigate that when there are LGBTQ participants in the room is really hard. And on the other hand, for a bunch of straight people to have the conversation without the voice of gay people is also kind of odd. So it's a real dilemma. And I don't think there's any right way to skin that cat. I think but it is a real dilemma, and you have to be aware of the impact of having the conversation on different groups of people. The one thing that we tried to focus on was stepping back from the gay text per se and having a conversation about what is it important for us to agree about as a congregation in order to have unity, and what can we afford to disagree about. And so we did a lot of teaching on Romans 14 and 15, which is one of the key texts for Third Way, and just saying, in the early church they had big disputes about big moral issues, like whether eating meat sacrificed to idols is okay, or whether Sabbath observance, which is rooted in the Ten Commandments, is binding on all Christians. And they found a way to label these as disputable matters, and in dealing with disputable matters allow for differences in conscience, but erring on the side of full acceptance and inclusion. So we tried to lay that as a groundwork for dealing not only with this question, but with all the controversial issues that are affecting the church and have over the years.
I'll add to that, since I was part of that process as well, and that we laid a lot of groundwork in sermons, that's for sure, but we also read, as a staff, we read several theology books, we read different texts together, and then we actually asked our leaders, and there were 65 to 70 leaders, to read Love as an Orientation, and then when it came out, I think we suggested they read Torn as well by Justin Lee. Those were some of the earlier texts that were more accessible for sort of lay theologians. And so those were books that we had conversations about. In fact, we were having conversations individually with all of our leaders, all 70 of them, and trying to keep track of, how those conversations were going and that sort of thing. So I guess we were reading different stories that were trying to lay the groundwork, and then eventually Ken wrote his letter to the congregation, and that was something that we were using as well.
Yep.
And Danny, you mentioned, I remember you mentioned this earlier, the key of having LGBT people a part of the congregation. I wonder how, especially for somebody who's coming from a traditional background, do you have any recommendations or thoughts or things that you noticed in your church?
So one of the questions that I'm faced with a lot is, Danny, what book did you read? What book would you recommend? And there are a lot of great books out there, but one thing I usually tell people is that if you think this is just a book that you can read to gain understanding, then I think that's where the problem is.
Yeah.
And so I know that in our church, we tried to deal with the text that dealt with homosexuality and Romans 1 and all of that. But for me, it was more important that you got to know people. And so for me, that was my journey, was getting to know not only gay people within the church, and for me it was, the people that, a lot of Christians will say, I know a gay person, and usually it's that someone that's struggling in the church with their sexuality. What I was trying to tell the church is, don't just get to know gay people who might agree with your theology and who are trying to live the celibate life, but get to know people outside of the church who maybe left the church, who have been harmed by the church. And so what I've tried to do and what I continue to try to do is elevate the voice of the LGBT person, because it's there that we nuance the conversation more, and we can look at the text not only purely as a theologian, but as a person or as a pastor. And so, yeah, as churches try to navigate through this discussion, of course, it's important to look at the biblical text. I mean, that's what we're about. But it's also very important to hear the voices of LGBT people on all sides of the spectrum, and it's there that you begin to see the ramifications of traditional teaching and how a lot of people have been harmed by it.
Mm-hmm.
Or the traditional application of the teaching, I should say.
And for you, Stacey, did you encounter that along the way?
Yeah, I was saying, just that, when we joined COVID, we didn't make sure that, okay, first before we go here, are you fully affirming? Because I don't think, that's not necessarily and can we serve as still a very tenuous issue, but as long as we can have conversations, and I think that's still important, and it is so important to a lot of LGBT Christians today. Being a part of the Gay Christian Network, as my wife and I are, a huge thing that keeps coming up is that just to continue to be visible. Because there's so many people and Christians, and I have many in my life still, and pastors that don't believe that you can actually exist to be, a Christian, understand how that works, and I think if we're open to being, just visible in those churches and have conversations, I think it changes a lot of, people's opinions, and it allows for people to have those conversations, and if this issue had come up and we hadn't entered, so it's sort of a give and take, I think, for both parts.
Well, then how would a church from a traditional background, would you have any specific recommendations? Because obviously there's a big difference in theology there. How would they, as a part of this process, include somebody from the LGBT side, and as a pastor thinking in an official way or in a procedural way, do you have any specific recommendations about how to do that?
I mean, from my perspective, the first thing that pops into mind is don't preach against specifically homosexuality. That's as been brought up before, it's really uncomfortable, and like you said, I don't think any pastors these days preach against divorce. I think that's just doesn't happen, and I think if people knew what it felt like to attend a church and wonder, is this the week that I'm going to be, it doesn't make you want to continue to go back. So I think just, like I said, not necessarily being 100% affirming, it's not a requirement, but like things like these, let's talk about this, let's meet over coffee, let's maybe start what's called a generous spaciousness small group. Sort of meet up and we can discuss what does this look like. I think those are some practical ways that churches can begin this conversation, and especially in a traditional setting.
My gut instinct is that it would take LGBTQ people who are pretty, I guess, strong or secure in who they are to be able to have those conversations. And so I think for people who can and are able, that's great. But I think some of the people that we've had coming in are so hurt by the church that almost feels like a setup for them to get hurt to me. So I don't know. I think one of the things that I have felt the most fire in me about is just encouraging pastors from traditional backgrounds to be really honest about where their church is at with their gay congregants. So to be able to say, we welcome you into our church in the sense that you can come and worship with us, but we don't allow members, or we do allow membership. We wouldn't allow you to lead. and just be very clear with that up front, because I think a lot of churches right now are sort of obfuscating that and making it sound like we welcome, and then gay people don't find out until they want to lead a small group or they want to teach Sunday school that they're actually not fully welcome. And so that way people can sort of sort out for themselves whether or not that's the conversation they want to be in and feel like they can be in, or whether they feel like that's maybe not a space that's safe for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I found that as a pastor, I think there's a burden on the leaders of the church to begin the process of having conversation with LGBTQ people, and I found that it was easy to find people to talk to if I wanted to at that stage. If I approached it with humility and said, I come from a traditional background, but I don't actually know that many gay people. And could we have coffee and just talk? And I'd like to hear your story. I'd like to hear your perspective. And I found people who were quite honored to be able to have that conversation, but because their belonging to the group wasn't threatened by virtue of how I decided on the issue, there wasn't as much at stake for them personally, and they weren't as at risk in the conversation. So I think leaders can, but they'll often have to go outside the church in order to do that, either by meeting people in open and affirming churches or friends or whatever, and just approaching them with humility.
It sounds like not having an agenda is important in that.
Right, and listening, and because that's the missing ingredient for most evangelical pastors, is that we have the traditional consensus down, and there's a gazillion books that will advocate it and argue for it, but what we don't have is what Danny's talking about, is that we don't have the first-hand experience from people up close and personal who've experienced the harmful effects of those policies.
Yeah, and I actually think, when I have these conversations with conservative or traditional pastors who one of their pushback would be, well, aren't we supposed to listen to the Bible first? We might get swayed by these stories, and it'll lead to emotionalism, and we won't be able to follow Scripture because we'll be blinded by these relationships. And honestly, I think when Jesus came as the incarnate Word of God, there were a lot of traditional beliefs going on. There were a lot of traditional teachings about purity laws, about Sabbath. And back then it seemed pretty clear that this is how to obey the Sabbath. But I think what Jesus did brilliantly was the way he discipled his disciples was that he showed them the ramifications of what the traditional teaching looks like, that it's actually causing a lot of harm. And so for Jesus, it wasn't just about quoting the Sabbath scriptures, because everyone was quoting the Sabbath scriptures. But Jesus was showing that, sometimes our traditional interpretation is actually not the correct interpretation. It might sound good on paper, but until you see that people who are starving and people who are injured are being prevented from becoming whole, then you have to take a step back. And that's why it's so important, as we're talking about having conversations with and elevating the voice of LGBT people. It's not that we're trying to go against Scripture, but I think Jesus is an example of how he taught was to understand Scripture in the context of relationship. And that's why Romans talks about love does no harm. And I think that's something that we always have to ask ourselves, is with any teaching of Scripture, is it causing harm? And that's why it's so important to invite people who are actually being affected by our teachings, by our application, and to listen to these people. Because if we don't listen, we could be just like the first century religious leaders that were just blindly trying to observe traditional teachings and not realizing that they were just so far from the kingdom.
And God will send people to you, if you're a pastor or leader with an open mind on this or open heart. God sent Cornelius to Peter. He didn't like get Peter all squared away apart from actually interacting with a real Gentile on the question of the inclusion of Gentiles. And Peter and Paul were engaged in conversations. They knew Gentiles, and that was part of their discernment process. And Peter didn't have the wherewithal to go asking to meet with a Gentile. God sent him one. So for many pastors and leaders, he's in the process of sending you Cornelius is. He sent, Stacy and her partner to the Grove Church, and they weren't seeking her out, but God sent her, and that's part of the process.
Yeah.
Following up on that, you guys have mentioned third way several times, and I'd love for anybody in this conversation to describe what that means, because I think you guys all have in mind a very specific application of that term.
Ken, it's your baby.
Well, I don't know about that, but third way is essentially a way of saying when we're dealing with controversies of this sort, we have some guidance in Scripture. And it's rooted in Romans chapter 14 and 15, where Paul introduces the concept of disputable matters. And again, if you read the text carefully and look at the solid, even conservative scholarship on the question, you see that the issues that Paul was dealing with involved in their time first-order moral concerns, like eating meat sacrificed to idols. And in that process, Paul is saying, look, there are these issues that within our church community, people of good faith, people who are faithful to Jesus, people who love Scripture, come up with different points of view. And we regard these as, this is a sign that we're dealing with a disputable matter. It's not something that's at the heart of Christian faith, and it's not at the heart of the gospel. It's not matters of the Apostles' Creed as a summary of biblical faith, for example. And when we're faced with a disputable matter, we err on the side of inclusion. When you read Romans 14, it's clear that Paul is talking about a robust acceptance. And so it's just not... so third way, I would say third way in practical effect for the gay person is the same as open and affirming, but we don't use the affirming language because... I personally don't think, I think the affirming language tends to imply what sometimes people mean by that is, I affirm you as a person, which of course we would all do, but sometimes people mean by that, I morally approve of what you're doing. And I think at the heart of the gospel is not this idea that our unity is based on our approving of each other morally, but at the heart of the gospel is we're accepted by virtue of the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. And so when we use that language of affirmation, I think we're importing a concept that isn't central to an understanding of the gospel. So that's why it's distinguished from that kind of a language. But for all practical purposes, it means fully inclusive at every level and suspending discriminatory practices that are aimed at LGBTQ people. Sometimes a simpler way of saying it is what every family has to do in order to go to Thanksgiving dinner with their extended family. And that we find ways of focusing on what we hold in common. And in order to be a family, we have to be able to put up with the crazy uncles and aunts and people who are on the wrong political view or the wrong side of pro-life or whatever the issue is. And that's what it takes for the church family to survive as well.
It honors the conscience of the person who might be more conservative in this and tells those who are more liberal, like, you cannot have contempt on those people, those brothers and sisters who are more conservative. And then it also tells those who are conservative, you cannot judge your more liberal brothers and sisters, but you have to include them. And so it requires a sacrifice for everyone, but it's not like a middle way or a compromised way. There's no exclusion.
So it sounds like a reorganization of a lot of the principles of church is that it's not just based on like getting it right or finding the right people or the right rules. It's based on love first, and those things under that are properly put in their place under that commandment to love.
Yeah.
And Danny, I know that in your church, this has led to engaging in many other areas around sexuality. or besides sexuality, race, gender, things like that. So the question for everybody is, how did this question relate to other controversial questions in the church, such as women in leadership, science, and scripture, all those things? Did they change? Did those others lead you in seeing how you saw sexuality, or was it more of your ways you changed in sexuality led to changes in others, or just what was the interplay in that? How has it affected your congregation?
So I think for us, going back to the third way for a second, one of the things that we have emphasized is that if we are the body of Christ, then that's the most important thing, that you're my brother and you're my sister, and that there are other issues that we can consider disputable, but at the end of the day, we can debate till we're blue in the face, but let's go take communion together.
Yeah.
And that's for us what kind of the third way looks. Sometimes it's really messy, sometimes it gets ugly. At the end of the day, we're like, okay, you're my brother, you're my sister. And so one of the things we've realized with that is that the Christian church has a bigger umbrella than I think we realized.
Right.
There are so many different branches within, Christianity, and that trying to draw lines of who's in and who's out has been pretty harmful.
Yeah.
And so we've begun more of a posture of trying to pay attention to other Christian traditions. Who, for us, it was, we were Southern Baptist, and, it was a traditional view of men and leadership. And so right after our church was dismissed from the Southern Baptist Convention, it opened up talks of justice and inequity and equality. And so because of that, because we were no longer under the Southern Baptist umbrella, we felt permission to begin to explore other areas. And so just a few months ago, we ordained our first woman pastor. And so, it's something like that, and so there's this intersectionality of justice issues, of how women have been treated, of how minorities, racial minorities have been treated. And so the conversation is going into, we're having Black Lives Matter conversations and conversations about science and things like that. And so it's opened it up. It's allowed us not to live in fear of, oh no, are we becoming, anti-God or anti-Christian? But realizing, those lines might not have been, maybe those lines shouldn't have been there in the first place. Because the presence of Christ could be found in the United Church of Christ, and the Methodist Church, and the Pentecostal Church.
Amen.
And we need to do a better job of paying attention to Jesus' prayer. That we would be one, as He and the Father are one.
Yeah. And the fact is that the church has been practicing third way for a long time without using that language or without rooting it in Romans 14 and 15. So, most evangelical churches, for all practical purposes, are doing a third way approach to remarriage after divorce. And they're doing a third way approach to the question of whether killing in war is murder, which was a big controversy in the early church, which leaned very pacifist in the early tradition, and then made accommodation for just war later on in the tradition, and so third way is not some novel approach. It's simply taking what we have done with other issues where there's been fierce contention in the church, and we've erred on the side of staying together, honoring Christ by loving one another through our disagreements rather than dividing over our disagreements. And when we learn that practices are harmful to real life human beings, always moving on the side of inclusion and acceptance at that point.
I have a question for Emily and Stacy from a traditional pastor. And he says, for pastors who hold a traditional understanding on marriage and sexuality, is there any hope for genuine tolerance for that understanding from the LGBT Christian community, or are we at a practical impasse?
I don't feel like I can speak for the whole LGBTQ community. Yeah. Stacey?
Yeah. Oh, I don't know that I can either, but I think my comment to that would be, we don't have to all agree. We regularly meet for coffee, and we get to know what's going on in each other's lives and just do life together. But I have other pastors in my life that I actually don't know where they land because they matter. I feel loved by them. And I think that that's what is the difference for me, is that I definitely know those people in my life that have a certain view on my marriage, and that make it be the first step that I would feel that would engage in conversation, is that I don't really care. I'm not trying to convince people of that my way is the best way. I don't think that at all. I think that there's room for all of these things to be okay under God's umbrella, and that if we can put love first and live that out in practical ways, then that's the first step. And I speaking as an LGBT Christian, I'm always open to learning and being challenged by God. Maybe He'll say down the road that today I feel peace about. So, but I love having conversations and engaging in multiple views. But like we've said before, it's not a salvation issue, and I think that that's what's important as well.
And I think it depends on what this pastor means by at an impasse. Yeah, I think I'm not really sure what that means. Like, if I attended that pastor's church and told him that I thought his marriage to his wife was not God ordained and I thought he should step down from pastoring, he probably wouldn't want to have me over for dinner.
Exactly.
And his wife probably wouldn't want me over for dinner, so we're probably not going to have like an intimate friendship because it's not a safe place for me to be vulnerable,
right?
Or for him to be. It's so. Yeah, you're probably not going to have really close friends if you're sitting in judgment on them. But can you have two people who just completely disagree who can acknowledge each other as brothers and sisters in Christ? Yeah, you can have that.
So what does that look like in the churches that you've been, and for all of you, where I think there have been, from hearing your stories, there have been folks both in the churches you were in and in the current context of your congregation, folks who are on the more traditional side, and how has that been as far as having those two different openly, so it's not just like we're affirming that there's kind of people we talk about, it's not we're traditional and there's people to talk about, but we're in this third way space and we're trying to make space for each other, and there are people who are very definitely traditional and people who are very definitely affirming of LGBT marriage together, including LGBT people who are actually in married relationships.
Sure.
What has that been like, and how is that space negotiated?
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. I would say that the people who have a more conservative view but who are committed to not excluding, which we have several in the church, that I think is fine, because I don't feel like there's like a stigma. They can acknowledge me as a pastor and they can acknowledge my marriage without feeling like they have to extend any kind of moral approval or judgment over it, but just sort of hold it loosely before God of, gosh, my conscience can't quite do this, but I'm willing to fully accept, and that feels okay to me, actually. That feels like they can live honestly without judgment. Yeah, that's fine. I haven't been able to sustain close friendships with people who would be committed to exclusion. I can release them to God, and what I've done is just done these like sort of prayer exercises where I just picture them in my hands and just say, okay, Lord, I just release them into your presence to be fully who they are and bless them in their path, but I don't feel like it's my burden to try to continue to like convince them or to gain their approval, or it's not good for me. It's not good for me psychologically or emotionally, and I don't think it's good for my wife either.
Third way is not a way to avoid conflict. Third way is a way through the conflict
Mm-hmm.
And if a pastor is unwilling, or a person is unwilling to recognize that this question of is God able to bless a same-gender covenantal relationship, if the person is not willing to recognize this as a disputable matter, then it is not resolvable. And if the person insists on,
Yeah.
in order to be faithful to God, in order for us to have a fellowship that's united, we have to exclude gay people, or we have to stigmatize them by saying they're not worthy to be, they're not morally worthy to be pastors, or I cannot recognize, a gay relationship by blessing it in a wedding ceremony, then it is irresolvable.
Mm-hmm.
And but that's been, LGBT people have been suffering that for many years, and so that's, in a sense, I think what's going on now is God is bringing the pain of what gay people have been experiencing in the church into the leadership level of the church, and leaders are having to wrestle with this and make hard choices, and when they choose not to exclude gay people, they start suffering the consequences that gay people
Mm-hmm.
have experienced in the church for a long, long time. They lose friends, they lose finances. Life is not as easy as it used to be, that sort of thing. So it's not a way to avoid conflict, it's a way through the conflict.
Now, Danny, I know we've worked with your church, and I know at least as much as 30% of your current congregation does have a more traditional understanding, including your co-pastor. So how do you guys negotiate that? You're still muted, I think, Danny.
Yeah, Danny, we don't hear you.
Sorry. You hear me now?
Yes.
I have a cough, so I keep muting myself.
Mhm.
The big thing is we focus on Jesus. I think one of the things that most churches, like Ken mentioned earlier, churches have always been practicing third way. Even though our church, beforehand, traditional Southern Baptist, there were divorced and remarried people in church. And there were leadership that wouldn't officiate those kind of marriages. There were leaders that would. And we as conservative churches know how to navigate through the differences of, say, divorce and remarriage. We don't go to every divorced couple and say, hey, have you actually repented of your sins? Because I think you're still an adulterer. We know how to grant grace to people in those spaces. And so even a conservative traditional person, a person who holds a traditional belief, I think, in the same way you would address a divorced and remarried couple in the church. I think we know how to do it graciously. Then you do it graciously with other things. And then so the way our church looks, it's just our focus, especially on Sundays, our focus has been on worship, on edification, and learning. And so for us, the leading question is how do we love one another? And it's less about trying to police everything, and more about what does it mean to be in community and love for one another. And so sometimes we'll get into a little debate here and there. We'll have meetings outside of church. We call it Third Way Thursday, where we meet around the fire and discuss all things debatable. Everything from evolution to universalism to sexuality. And try to do it with a lot of listening, with a lot of grace. And so I think for us, I'll end with this on this question, is the posture that we're trying to model and get everyone to embrace is a posture of listening. Of knowing that we don't have all the answers. We could be wrong in our beliefs. And so it's important for us, to listen to one another. And not necessarily try to prove the other person wrong.
Something that I've thought as listening to you guys is key in all of your kind of evolution was relationship and kind of this implicit idea of harm and not harm, and where is the harm occurring. And it seems to me, just as I'm interpreting what you guys are saying, the key to the disputable matters idea is that you've been convinced that something that you're interacting with, something that you have people on different sides on, is not causing like this imminent great harm, or the harm is disputable in some way. Like Danny, you were convinced that excluding people was causing this great harm, and through your interaction, you've met lots of couples who are LGBT where, say, even if you weren't convinced of that God blesses same-sex union, you've seen that there has been blessing in that environment, and there hasn't been this sweep of harm. And I think that a lot of the narrative that comes out of the very, very traditional side would say that if you give an inch on this, there's a lot of harm that would come in. And you guys, it sounds like you guys have been convinced differently, and that's key to making a part of it a disputable matter.
Yeah, I think that is key, and you know, I don't think it's healthy for the church to overthrow a traditional consensus that has held for centuries, unless there's really strong evidence that it's harmful. And so, and I think, you know, that's just a humble posture. It's not up to each generation to reinvent Christianity from scratch and you know, make it suit our modern sensibilities or something. We need to be humble about our approach to truth, but in the same way, we have to be humble about the reality of people's experience. And I think it's simply the fact that gay people have been willing and courageous to bear witness to what their lives are like and the effect of these policies on their lives. And we can see the fruit of the Spirit in their lives, and they've been willing to be open with us increasingly, that now we can finally come to the point of saying, yeah, these are harmful practices. But if someone doesn't agree that these practices are harmful, what incentive would they have to question the traditional consensus? I think it's a key issue. And the Bible, I think, for that very reason, puts such an emphasis on love does not harm the neighbor. You know, because Paul was he experienced and he executed policies in the name of biblical truth that he later came to deeply regret, because he saw that he was harming the Messianic Jews that he was persecuting. And so it's a biblical check on the wrong kind of ideological, you know, lack of humility and hubris and over certainty about our point of view, to have this strong in the tradition. Love doesn't harm the neighbor. It's just meant to make us question when we see the fruit of the Spirit is love, and so when our policies aren't bearing that kind of fruit, that's the time to rethink them. Mm. And you know, the evidence for harm is quite considerable, and it's growing. You know, many of the leaders of the ex-gay movement have been telling us that, you know, that claims of healing are grossly exaggerated, and they've been bearing witness to the kind of experience it is to try to live celibate when you don't have the gift of celibacy, or to you know, try to change something that's so integral to your being. And the social scientists are, you know, doing studies and saying if you grow up, if you're a gay kid and you grow up in a church that has traditional policies, you have negative mental health outcomes, and normally being part of a church is, if anything, it's a positive. And so this is, you know, the evidence is out there. We just have to not cherry pick whose stories we listen to. You know, as Danny said, you need to increase your sample size, you know, and talk to people who are not in the church, who've had a different experience than the 2 or 3 people you know who have same-sex attraction and are working hard to be celibate, and have been doing that for 3 years, you know.
Stacy and Emily, for somebody who's from a who is LGBTQ and a Christian, something I've actually heard a lot from them is they're processing, I'm at this church, it's like my family's church, it's my church background, it's church in my denomination, and they're not affirming of me, and I'm trying to love in the midst of that, and how do I do that? You know, when should I stay? When should I go? I know you can't, that's always a personal question, but I'm curious of some things that you guys have learned along the way that you think are really important for somebody in that position.
Yeah, that's again the age-old question coming from the LGBT Christian community. I mean, there's a reason why currently Taz and I are not part. So we've had some time to heal of what's happened, and we're so close. Sort of feel that conversation within each other, and just asking, what do we basically, what can we sustain, and what do we sort of say, no, we can't do this, and that is difficult. There's no getting around that. But I think, like we've all been saying, is as long as there's not like, they'll stop us at the door and say, well, you're the gay people, so you sit here, and the spotlight is on you. In a negative light, I think that's sort of number one. I mean, if we can, we don't have to come in and say, well, next week we want to be in the. We don't have all these list of rules that we're bringing. We just want to be a part of this community, and so I think it is slowly getting better. Not to say that we won't get hurt again. Not to say that LGBT Christians won't get hurt again. But I just think it's so important to not give up. Because God is for all of us, and I think that if we remember that, and if we act out grace in our own lives, emails from a lot of our friends that are very traditional, and just from them observing how we've reacted to those things in our life, they've seen I can't understand you're giving grace to somebody that doesn't give grace to you, and I see Jesus more in that than I do in that traditional Christians, and I'm asking myself questions now that I wouldn't normally. So I think just being open to that is a huge part for us. So I mean, like I said, we're continuing on this journey as well. So it's a tough one.
My wife Rachel is actually working on a blog post about that. We probably have different views on it, and I think if you ask me in a year, I might have a different answer. But I'm less than a year off of losing my job, and having stayed in my denomination trying to create change from within, I think, one, you have to feel really called to it. I felt like it was something that God was asking me to do, but I don't think in good conscience I could recommend that to most people at this point, because I feel like the emotional and psychological harm of being stigmatized or feeling like you're the one that has to carry out the conversation, or it's exhausting. And I think if you're asked to do it by God, it can be a calling. But I would actually recommend to most people that they find a church where they are fully accepted for who they are, if they're just wanting to live their lives and grow spiritually. That said, my wife Rachel was in a church where she came out and was in leadership, and they told her she wouldn't be allowed to lead in the future. They wouldn't kick her out of her current leadership spot because they didn't want to disrupt their church too much. And she stayed for a couple of years after that, and I was kind of going back and forth. I was kind of challenging her a little bit of like, is it some sort of like I don't know, like this pleading to please accept me sort of thing? Is that the reason that you stay? Like, please, just accept me? And she said, no, I felt like I was trying to take control of my own story. Like, if I left, that people would write my story for me and say that I had just walked away from faith, or see, I had walked away from my community. And she felt like she wanted to say, no, I'm being faithful to God in the midst of this process, and Jesus is talking to me. And so it was a place of, she felt like it was a position of power, but she did eventually leave after a couple of years because it was harmful. So, she was wanting to write a blog post of like questions to ask yourself about whether you should stay or go, which I'll encourage her to continue to do, because I think it's a good question.
Well, I think we're coming down to our final few questions, and so one that I have gotten repeatedly that I wanted to ask you guys is, I think you've answered implicitly, but I think there's more, is why would you do this as a pastor? Because for most of as all of you guys have shared, you suffered significant loss. You lost either your congregation as well, and you had to form a new congregation. Danny, I know you lost about 30 or 40%. There is one church in Los Angeles that is a non-denominational evangelical church that used to be a Baptist church that made this transition, and they didn't lose a single member. That is the only church I've heard of that has been true. Every other church has lost at least 5 to 10%, if not 30 or 40. So why would you do this, and how has this been a positive or negative in your life?
Why you would do this if you're evangelical? For an evangelical, the crack cocaine that keeps us getting up in the morning is stories of people being accepted by Christ, being thrilled that they're accepted by Christ, and feeling like it totally revolutionizes their life.
Yeah.
And there's a whole population of people among the sexual minorities who have not experienced acceptance in the church. They haven't experienced acceptance by Christ, and when they do, it's just the most wonderful thing in the world. So I mean, I feel like I've had more of the juice of being an evangelical pastor in the past few years as I've heard these stories than I had in a lifetime before that. So it's extremely rewarding. It's like, well, this is what I signed up for. You know, I didn't sign up to be a pastor in order to have like some good helping profession kind of job. I was a registered nurse before I did this. I could make as much money and I could help lots of people as a registered nurse. I signed up as a pastor because I was following Jesus. And part of following Jesus is you have to stand with the disinherited and the oppressed. And it's a wonderful experience to actually do that. It makes faith a lot more real. It makes your relationship with Jesus a lot more real. So there's nothing but benefit for going down this path, other than a little economic insecurity and some lost friendships, lost in the Christian world. That's nothing compared to the experience that we all signed up for as evangelical pastors. Right, Danny?
Amen. Yeah, I think it's true. Everything Ken said. There's the loss of friendships. There's a loss of church members. We've cut our budget almost in half, I think. It's been really hard. But at the end of the day, I look at the Spirit of Christ and His posture to the least of these. Sometimes we have to, leave the 99 to go after the one. And the way I saw it, there's so many churches for everyone to go to, but there were hardly any safe places for LGBT people. And that saddened me. And the day we restarted New Heart after the split, people found out about us, through the news, and almost immediately, we had an influx of LGBT people coming in, and half of them hadn't been to church in over 10 years. And these are people that had been looking for a safe place just to worship. And so, like Ken said, it's been so incredible. When I hear their stories of being marginalized and just oppressed and kicked out of their homes and kicked out of their schools, demonized, and then they finally find a church like ours where they can just worship and be loved and contribute. It's just the most beautiful thing. And so, yeah, first time in my life where I've felt like this is like the first century church where, people were coming in, and thinking, wow, am I really loved by God? And that's what we're witnessing, and it's just been the most incredible thing. And so, yes, there's some cost, but not nearly as great as the joy that we're seeing, and people coming to Christ, and people coming back to God, of people not throwing away their faith, and so it's just been phenomenal. It's just been Uh, it's been incredible. And so, yeah, I agree with Kev on that.
I have two thoughts on that. The first would be it's missional. You know, churches that can't figure out women, science, LGBT, other justice issues are just not setting themselves up for the mission for the long haul to create a church where younger people are going to engage in their faith and their faith communities. But two, like what we had, like what came out of it, the people that were left is like the most precious and vulnerable community you could ever imagine, because we made it truly a safe space. We felt like there were people who had all sorts of other things where they had felt marginalized, either in their families or in their church community, who are now safe to just say, this is who I am, and we are all beloved children of God. And like Danny said, the communion table is that precious space where we all come together as equals and as brothers and sisters. And I wouldn't trade like this smaller, more safe, more vulnerable community for anything in the world, because as one of my mentors told me, she said, there's no unity without justice. People are afraid of breaking up their church community, but like we're not in it to keep a certain group of people together, right? We're in it because the unity of the Spirit is a unity of diversity. My friend Caroline's like, you know, when every knee bows and every tongue confesses, those knees and tongues are going to be from very different people all over the world, but it's a unity of diversity, and that's what we're in to protect. So it's the gospel.
I know for just for us doing Sanctuary, one of the things that we think about a lot is that Jesus calls us to lose. Jesus calls us to die, and that is something where we actually find real faith. That you know, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, he's like, you know, if Jesus didn't really rise from the dead, then what we're doing is for nothing. And I think one of the glorious things is that by pursuing what we've been doing and then watching a lot of other people do too, is we find that it doesn't always make rational sense from like an economic perspective. And what I've experienced in talking to pastors who have been doing things that are along a rational economic perspective is like there seems to be sometimes like a loss of faith, not necessarily like a total loss of faith or a loss of it, but it's like this doesn't feel actually like miraculous supernatural power. This feels like I'm doing this to get money or whatever. And I talked to a lot of people obviously have come out of that, and they talk about the difference.
That's because this is revealing our idols. It's revealing. I mean, when it happened, when things first started to go down in our church, both Ken and I had the same response of like people were worried about the building, and it's just a building. The building became an idol. And so it's revealing what is it that we're putting ahead of the gospel of Jesus.
Yeah. So I know for us, it's been a joy to learn how to lose and to live in God's power. I just feel so much more, my faith feels so much more alive. So I just echo what all of you have said. We're actually about out of time. Thank you all for joining us. I'll give you guys just a minute if you have any closing thoughts, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Well, you know, I guess one thing I'd say is if there are any pastors who are listening in, you know, we'd welcome the opportunity to be able to converse with you about these things. And I think Danny and I both know and Emily too know the experience of having to wrestle with a question like this alone, and it's a kind of psychological torture to just have to deal with this alone. And so I think this is really important for us pastors to be finding avenues to bring our questions, and you know, I think Danny and I and Emily are very sympathetic to the sensibilities and concerns of the traditionalist position, because we've all held it, and we've held it with conviction.
Yeah.
And it's quite a process to re-examine that. So I think you know, either through our community group, or if you have some other way of accessing some people where you can find safe space to talk about things with real candor, I think that's that the Holy Spirit will be involved in that kind of a process. So look for that, I'd say.
Yeah, and let me piggyback off of that, and then I'll just let you guys continue. Is we are going to be having, repeating, if you weren't here earlier, we are going to be having community groups that are not webinars, they're not live to the internet, they're just personal, just a group of 5 to 10 people with Ken and Danny and others soon as well. For pastors specifically right now who are looking for a safe place to talk, especially if you're traditional, come from a very conservative background, you have a lot of questions and you don't know where you can ask them, and it's really hard. Please contact us at www.sanctuaryforall.org. Send us a message on our Contact Us page. Tell us you're interested, and we'll let you know more. Those are going to be starting next week on Tuesday. If you're watching this sometime in the future, that's Tuesday, October the, what is Tuesday? October the 4th? Is that right? October the 4th or 5th? Something like that. Tuesday in early October of 2015.
First Tuesday.
But there will be, those are going to continue. We're going to be expanding those. There's going to be a lot more. There's going to be groups for LGBT Christians who are looking to figure out this whole question of faith and sexuality, led by people like Stacy and Emily and others. Groups for parents will be led by parents as well. But this first ones that we're starting next week are for pastors who are looking for safe space. So please send us a message if you're interested.
And those will be monthly, right, James?
Say that again?
Those will be monthly gatherings, yep.
Monthly right now, that's correct, yep. So, well, thank everybody. I'll go ahead and let you go. I know you guys have your work schedules and busy days ahead of you, but this was a real pleasure and a privilege.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Cool.